The British Queen Elizabeth II has secretly intervened in a Scottish organic law for an exception in her favour. In doing so, she used a centuries-old privilege that allowed her to influence legislation. As The Guardian revealed, she was the only person in Scotland to be exempted from using renewable energy. In the Commonwealth of Nations, the Queen's Consent regulation applies, according to which the consent of the Queen is required so that a draft law can be submitted to Parliament if it could affect royal interests. The Scottish Parliament also adheres to this approval requirement. As reported by the Guardian newspaper, the Queen's lawyers secretly intervened with Scottish ministers earlier this year to amend a bill to reduce carbon emissions. The law envisaged the construction of district heating pipes to heat residential and commercial buildings with renewable energy instead of separate fossil fuel boilers. For this purpose, real estate should also be allowed to be expropriated. According to the office of Energy Minister Paul Wheelhouse of that time, the Queen's lawyers had expressed concerns, wrote The Guardian. Wheelhouse then tabled an amendment that only applies to the Queen's privately owned land and prevents her and her land from being expropriated and dug up for the construction of the eco-pipelines. The Scottish MP, is MSP I think in that case, Andy Whiteman, who considered an exception for the Queen to be wrong, Wheelhouse replied in the parliamentary debate that the exception was necessary to ensure the smooth passage of the bill. However, Wheelhouse kept quiet about the fact that the Queen's lawyers had previously intervened. The change was passed and the Queen gave her consent to the law. After Whiteman was later informed about the intervention, he was shocked, according to The Guardian. That should have been said in the debate, he says. Nonetheless, as one of the largest landowners in Scotland, the Queen is now the only person in the country not obliged to allow the construction of pipes to heat buildings with renewable energy. Her intervention is all the more astonishing as her son Prince Charles and her grandson Prince William like to emphasize their commitment to climate protection, and it is weird to hear that. According to The Guardian, Buckingham Palace emphasized that the Queen's consent is a parliamentary act in which the Queen takes on a purely formal role and that it always given when the government requests it. Whether the Queen's consent is necessary, the Parliament decides regardless of the royal house in question that affect the interests of the Crown, including personal property and personal interests of the monarch, said the palace. However, there are increasing examples of the Queen repeatedly using her privileged access to draft legislation between the late 1960s and 1980s to persuade ministers to change British legislation in her favour. According to The Guardian, for example, she was able to conceal the extent of her private wealth. In another case, the government is said to have waived that the general traffic rules also apply to the royal estates of Balmoral and Sandringham. University of Liverpool constitutional lawyer Adam Tucker said, "The revelations made it clear that the Queen's consent was more than a mere formality and should raise serious concerns about the continuation of the practice." Willie Rennie, who recently resigned as chairman of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, also criticized the secret doors to legislation for the monarchy. He said, "Others who advocate change have to declare that. That should apply to everyone," said Rennie. "Each of these interventions should be made public." However, the Scottish government around Nicola Sturgeon did not answer questions about the number of bills that provided special exceptions for the Queen. In a brief statement it said, "The consent of the Crown is required by law when a bill affects private property or the interests of the sovereign, and that is the case in this case." Scotland, with a population of around 5.5 million, is ambitiously pushing ahead with the shift from fossil fuels to sustainable energies. The country already obtains 97.4% of the electricity it needs from renewable energies, and the proportion has risen rapidly in the recent past. But the days of oil are not over. Oil and gas exploration and related services continue to account for around 10% of Scottish gross domestic product, so Scottish GDP. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.